This topic is part of a larger topic about how Jesus and John the Baptist got killed and why they were killed. Today, I'd like to look at the historian Josephus and what he says about John the Baptist. He also made some comments about Jesus and James, the brother of Jesus. But today, let's take a look at what he has to say about John the Baptist and why John the Baptist was killed. It says, "Now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, that very justly, as a punishment of what he did against John, who was called the Baptist. For Herod slew him, who was a good man. Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion." So he had him put to death. Let's take a very special note of that part where Josephus says that Herod feared that John, because of his influence and popularity, might raise a rebellion. So, not that he actually did start a rebellion, but it's just the risk or the fear that he might start a rebellion. That's a very key point. That's very important because that would apply to Jesus also. Just the fear that he might draw people or raise a rebellion. Not that he actually did, but looking at this historically, okay? Let's move on further here. Gamaliel in the book of Acts talks about others who had a following. They were also killed and the followers dispersed. Let's look at what Gamaliel says in Acts chapter 5. "But a Pharisee in the council named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, held in honor by all the people, stood up and gave orders to put the men aside for a little while. And he said to them, 'Men of Israel, take care what you're about to do with these men,'" meaning some of the disciples of Jesus, okay, in Jerusalem. Verse 36, "For before these days Theudas rose up, claiming to be someone, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered." So Gamaliel gives two examples of different popular figures that had quite a following. The first one, 400 followed him. He does not say who killed these two leaders. The Gospels and the New Testament, for that matter, they kind of marginalize this. They want to try to blame things on the Jews, that the Jews killed Jesus. But this is, historically speaking, this is dishonest because it is well known that it was the Roman Empire and they killed these people for political reasons. What was happening in the cultural situation at the time is they kept expecting a deliverer, a messianic type of figure who would restore Israel as a nation. So anybody who had a following and became popular, they would try to push that person, or even that person himself, like Theudas, maybe proclaimed himself as a type of Messiah figure. But all of them came to failure. And these are just a few examples that the New Testament gives, that there were actually other people who had a following. So far, we had John the Baptist, according to Josephus. We also see this Theudas. Then we see Judas the Galilean. Let's look and see if we can find some other examples in the New Testament. This is also in the book of Acts, chapter 21, where Paul is before a tribune and the speaker is talking to him. Okay, it says, as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And then the person answered back and said, "Do you know Greek? You are not the Egyptian, then, who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness." Paul replied, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city." Paul, according to the Gospel of Acts, Paul himself is being obscure. He doesn't say the name of the city. He just says a citizen of no obscure city. At another place in Acts, he says that he's a citizen of Rome, even though in Paul's letters he doesn't claim that. Okay, continuing on. "I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people, and when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language. First thing to note, there was this person named the Egyptian recently who, wow, led a revolt, 4,000 people, led them out into the wilderness. That's pretty huge. I think the New Testament authors are really marginalizing this because they don't want to be attached or linked in any way to revolutionaries or people who are going against the Roman government. But that's interesting because this tribunal leader is saying, "Do you know Greek?" So Paul is that's his language actually. He's a Greek speaker and he writes his letters in Greek. And you know, it's just the connection here. It says you are not that Egyptian who led a revolt recently. Look down further where it says, and then Paul addressed the crowd in the Hebrew language. Interestingly, the NIV says Aramaic, and even in this version here, the English Standard Version, there's a footnote, the small letter E there's a footnote where it says, or the Hebrew dialect, probably Aramaic. That is very interesting because sometimes in the New Testament, this is what scholars like to pick apart. Sometimes in the New Testament, when they say Hebrew, they actually mean Aramaic because Aramaic was a very closely related language. Okay. So it was in Aramaic. Now, as a side study to this, when Paul, who spent he was not even in Jerusalem, most of the time, according to his letters. He was off doing his own thing. But when he did actually make a trip to Jerusalem, in Galatians chapter 1, he says he did meet with Peter and with James, the brother of the Lord, for 15 days. He met Peter. And I've always had the question, what language were they talking to each other in? Because if Jesus and his disciples were Aramaic speakers and economically they were very poor, well, they probably were not fluent in Greek or able to write in Greek. So the language that Paul probably spoke to Peter in was probably in Aramaic. So Paul was fluent and could write in Greek, and he also knew Aramaic. I would postulate that. Yeah, I would say on pretty sure ground with that. Let's take a look here. Moving on to Jesus. Could it have been for a very similar reason that Jesus was crucified by the Roman Empire? For political reasons. Could it have been? Could it have been that they feared because he was so popular that, oh, we better get rid of him because, well, what's going to happen here? And I have a verse actually about that. That was the verse that was in John. Okay, in John here it says, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. So these are the Jewish leaders supposedly speaking. So even they knew, according to the author of John, they knew that if somebody became too popular, the Romans will come and take care of it. So this was known, even though the New Testament blames it all on the Jews, that the Jews killed him, but historically it was the Romans who had him crucified. Let's look at a few possible reasons why. In Mark 11, when Jesus came to Jerusalem, there's these crowds, they're shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Those are powerful words, because that means in the line of David, which means a king. What if all these people are shouting and shouting and shouting about him being a king? That's going to stir up the authorities. That's going to catch the attention of the authorities. After that, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So he went to stay nearby Jerusalem, but not actually right in Jerusalem. Okay, so the next day, he entered the temple and he began to drive out those who sold in the temple. He overturned tables of money changers. That sounds kind of violent, okay? And who sold pigeons, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Whoa, that sounds like the occupation of the temple. Most Bibles will say the cleansing of the temple. That sounds like an occupation of the temple, a violent occupation. I know that that doesn't fit well with theology, but this is what the text is saying in Mark. He would not allow anyone to carry. The Gospel of John says he made a whip of cords. I mean, this is getting pretty wild. Now, these little details that are not often mentioned, the Gospel Luke says, anyone who does not have a sword, go and sell his cloak and buy one. They said to him, Lord, here are 2 swords. He says that's enough. Then in the Garden of Gethsemane, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And then one of them just struck with the sword. And John identifies that as being Peter. But in Luke, it's not, the person's not identified who it was, but it was Peter. Then what happened was they evidently lost the clash of swords in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus was arrested. All the disciples fled, according to Mark and according to Matthew, and then Jesus was crucified. The fact that he was crucified with other criminals that are said to be robbers, some versions. There's also Barabbas, who was in prison for taking part in an insurrection. So they had him killed for that reason. The inscription on the cross was King of the Jews. So that's why he was killed. Whether he actually caused an uprising or not, or even if they just thought that he would, but he was killed for those reasons. And that'll about wrap it up for today.